Hello, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Ricky. Thanks for having me.
Are you ready to dive in?
Yes, let's do it.
I would love to learn more about little Natalia. What was she like and what did she dream about?
Yes. Well, little Natalia grew up in Oregon, and it was a pretty rural area with not too much light pollution. So I got to enjoy a lot of stargazing and watching the ISS pass overhead or spent stages of rockets. And that really piqued my interest in aliens and space from a young age. And I also really liked math. I don't know how that came about, but now that I have little kids, I'm trying to figure out how one cultivates that. And in high school, I learned that you could combine those two into aerospace engineering. So, I stuck with that track. I also have always had this sense, and I think it comes from some personal events in my life, but that life is short and we're kind of insignificant in the big picture, which I think one could take to be sort of depressing, but I always found it um, inspiring and took away from that sense, motivation to build cool, impactful things and be a kind person.
I love that so much, and that deeply resonates with me. My mom similarly was really passionate about ensuring that I had an enjoyment of math, which I did pick up. And so she definitely had her way. And
Okay,
um,
we might need to dig into that.
absolutely. And I think there's definitely this flow state that I would reach in doing math, and learning from her, and just that feeling of when it clicks, which translates over to when you then create those big, impactful things as you have done. And from this journey, you then invented a new chemical rocket technology prior to your PhD and turned it into a startup before finishing your degree. What was the moment when you really conceived of that idea, and how did you translate it to something that you could execute on?
Yeah, well, unfortunately for this story and the podcast episode, I actually, this has been a theme in my life where I got to, stand on the shoulders of other people. And that particular creative moment belonged to my research advisor when I was at Duke working on that technology for my master's. Um, he he was at MIT for grad school and started. He was on part of the group working on the uh, micro turbine engine and had seen firsthand that when you try to scale down these rotating components, the speed at which they need to rotate actually goes up, which is unfortunate for tiny little bearings that are being asked to rotate at like 2 million RPM. Um, and so that was a very critical failure point in that idea. And so he had the scar tissue and hard won lessons from that and realized that we want to do away with any moving parts at these small scales, um, lest we need to invent new bearing technology. And so he thought, why not apply the, Venturi principle to pressurizing fluids to the pressures needed to get them into a rocket combustion chamber. And so we took that concept and an idea that was um, first conceived of by somebody named Gifford, and the technique is called a Gifford injector. And by entraining the fuel or oxidizer using a different working fluid, you can actually reach chamber the pressures needed to support combustion inside a rocket chamber. So it was by collaborating with him and You know, I was the one putting in like the late hours in the lab, but really, it was his idea.
And that's so wonderful to learn more about and to underscore where there isn't all this pressure to have idea generation down pat as a student, but knowing that there's so much opportunity and ideas all around you and that you can put in that work and learn so much about the process, which I think was really foundational, I would assume, to then help invent an entirely new ion engine technology as you did at MIT Space Propulsion Lab that became the foundation for your company. I would love to go inside that moment. What was it like to go through that process and then step into the CEO role at Accion Systems? What did that mean to you then?
Yeah, well, I think, there are two important points in what you just said. And one is that, this isn't original of me to say, but the idea of the like lone genius inventor that's, shut up in a weird lab in their basement coming up with all these new things is largely a myth. And at Axion in particular, there was a really neat genesis story of how we came to start working on that technology. And I think we should generalize that afterwards into how one could come up with new ideas in general. So what happened was that there was a fellow named J.B. Fenn who realized that you could extract large biomolecules from a liquid by applying a strong enough potential between the liquid and a downstream electrode. And it was sort of a gentle extraction. So these could be really long chain molecules. And during this gentle extraction process, they wouldn't break apart and be damaged, and you could send them through a mass spectrometer and study them that way. And previously, other techniques would damage them because they were too violent or aggressive. And then shortly after that, the whole sort of computer silicon MEMS fabrication industry took off, and techniques for making components on really small scale started to become more ubiquitous. And MIT ended up building its own, research fab where researchers could um, practice making things at these small scales and bringing stuff to life orders of magnitude smaller than they had before. And none of that, those two things alone, I think wouldn't have been so important, except for the fact that around the early 2000s 2010s, people were becoming interested in launching small satellites again. And I say again because it was really like the third coming of small satellites. It wasn't really novel to the early 2000s, but there had been some cycles. Oh, and actually I'm reading Safi Bakal's book Loon Shots, where he talks about the multiple deaths that radical ideas have to go through before they stick. So shout out to Safi. And so the fact that people were wanting to build smaller and smaller spacecraft meant that they needed to look to new options for maneuvering them around in space because the traditional propulsion systems didn't scale down very well. So there were these three pieces: the extracting charged particles from a liquid, the ubiquitousness of building things on these small scales, and the momentum and demand for smaller scale propulsion systems that created the conditions for Axion. And so the to generalize that, I think, those came from different industries, and really you can't connect dots like that unless you're curious and walking the halls of other labs and always learning. So we'll underscore that, I think. And then that moment of deciding that, well, this is so new and different and has some, unmet demand was when we decided to form the company. And then stepping into the CEO role, I've been, a reluctant CEO twice now. I didn't I didn't see myself as being the CEO, but it sort of shook out that way over like the first year of Accion. And I think, immediately after going from being a grad student to CEO, I found the people side just so scary and awful. And I can say that because I came to love it after some time. But at first I hated it. I was working with an executive coach, and I would tell her like, I want to fire everybody and hire robots, and she's like, you have to stop saying that. um, so it was going from being, an IC, an individual contributor, alone in lab at 2 a.m., to being, the face of a company, the person responsible for the livelihood of my employees, the person largely responsible for how particularly, junior employees would develop and for their early career arc, and being responsible for all this money people suddenly trusted me to handle. So a lot of, responsibility and a lot of messy people stuff that on many occasions I found more challenging than the rocket science we were doing.
Absolutely. And it it definitely is. The people side is often so much harder than the technology that we're building or just even communication. And there's so many follow-up questions from what you shared. And I think the first thread I'd love to pull upon is um, generalizing that idea generation phase and how it is this um, combination of ideas and you're connecting the dots. Because what I'm hoping resonates with the audience and anyone in a similar phase or anyone in a process of connecting different dots is there is often this glamorized version of what it looks like to have an idea and to receive it. And then there's what what happens when you've actually done it and when you share what it really looks like and what it feels like. And sometimes there is this gap between the stories that are shared online and what makes the headlines versus how to actually um, make something viable and build something real that has really big impact. And I would love to hear your thoughts on what that looked and felt like, and those thoughts that you were referencing to in terms of generalizing that, because um, for some people I've spoken to, maybe it's look like sticky notes or a business notebook, or a Notion page where they kind of combine all these ideas or they're talking to people in different rooms. But you have so much wisdom in this area and have spent such a long time kind of like thinking about it, writing about it, talking about it, and being in it. And yeah, your thoughts on this would be so valuable.
Yeah, I think in a really ideal world, given the experiences I've had, I would always be able to build new things and have impact on the world by starting completely from a problem that some group experienced. Um, and it would be totally black and white. There would be no preconceived idea of the technology, but it would be so driven by um, some need that was just not being met today. And the reality, though, is that if you totally started that way, at least one issue is that it could be 20, 30 years before technologies arose and were mature enough to start solving that need. So the gray areas are that really you need to be learning about problems and new technologies and new things that are possible all the time simultaneously. And then more often than not, the solution is some combination of new innovations that weren't possible before that now can solve that. And the reason I think that's, one of the reasons that's important to not approach everything as a technology push, but instead to at least get as much like problem and market pull as you can, is because otherwise your technology just doesn't check enough of the boxes for the users. And there's always something that they're doing before you, even if that something is doing nothing. But you have to be, you know, the rule of thumb is be 10 times better than, what somebody was doing before, because people are lazy and there's, inertia, and um, things are hard to switch from. And that's why that rule of thumb is 10 times better. And a lesson, I think going into Accion, I thought, well, on no one dimension are we necessarily 10 times better, but if you add up these like three or four dimensions and blur your eyes a little bit, in aggregate we're 10 times better. But the really painful lesson is that that's not how customers make decisions to adopt and buy technologies. They don't view those things in aggregate. They usually care about one of them. Um, so that's, maybe the thing that I have the most trauma around, is learning that lesson really hard. And then, actually in close second is also a lot of the problems I care about solving, need deep tech sort of solutions. So not, a widget or some kind of straightforward software approach, but deep tech to mean that there's probably still some R&D left before you can deliver something that meets even a small, cohort's needs. And under the surface of that R&D are often many, sometimes even bigger R&D projects, and all of those unknown unknowns that you don't know going into it. And so, on the one hand, I think if you did know, you probably wouldn't even try. So it's better. But underestimating the remaining work is also a big risk. So there has to be some balance there between like ignorance and foresight in the challenges ahead if you want to make something a reality. There was one more.
Those were just, yeah, incredible insights. And I resonate so deeply with connecting to those really complex technologies and really enjoying those hard questions there, but then also the business side of it. And um, I find the complexity of the people and the fundraising and all of those pieces equally interesting. I think of it all as these the cogs, and I'm like, ooh, I just want to figure it out.
Mhm.
And as you shared, sometimes because the technical challenges are so demanding, maybe the pull in another direction is just it can be really taxing. Like in any kind of relationship, there is um we would much rather prefer levity and ease and allow those things to kind of be the oil that allows everything else to kind of move and flow. And oftentimes when we have those challenges and we would much rather have robots or just work in isolation, we have to kind of get ourselves unstuck. And you mentioned working with an executive coach, and you've also learned through these experiences. What do you carry with you now in terms of those lessons? Because there must have been so many when it comes to the people development, hiring and letting folks go, talking to people and fundraising. They're each of these like different compartments or boxes, but maybe there's also lessons and threads through it all, but I was wondering if you had things to share in those areas where, again, entrepreneurship online and in the headlines is really glamorized. And then there's just these like really um, tough areas around it that depending on um, what each founder or CEO strengths are, they maybe they're hiring around it or they're getting help around it, but just hearing your perspective on what you've learned from those would be so meaningful.
Yes. Okay. Great. I love the framing there. One thing that I think I've learned, maybe one of the most important pieces of building an organization and getting people to follow you into unknown is probably storytelling. And I've really come to appreciate how important that is, and being able to think of, the arc for the company and the narrative around that, and using that to inspire people, using it to inspire yourself to get out of bed on the days when, everything is going wrong. It's also important for fundraising. I have this process each time I had to raise a round, and we the company was acquired at our Series C, which might sound like seed A, B, C, four rounds, but that, in my experience, it is not very like linear like that. We did seed A, A2, bridge, A, B. I don't know. It was a very circuitous path to get to the letter C. Um, but each time I would prepare for that, I would know that I had the bones of my deck and pitch ready when I could practice and walk through the story and the main points. And at the end, be like, yes, I want to invest in this. Where do I sign? And, getting so excited again about the story I was telling and how big this could be and how impactful. So storytelling being very important. And then another really big sort of learning and now kind of philosophy for me is that, I think when you're putting together these groups of people, it's really, people want to work with other smart people that they respect and look up to, and that they know have the company's best interest in mind, and everybody's, rowing in the same direction. So, um, I think what I just said is important, is that they trust one another, but also that they're, intellectually excellent. I like to look for. But that trust piece is really important, because you're moving fast and you're going to be sloppy in how you interact sometimes. So, along with trust, I also have found that I just had to get really good at apologizing, because everybody's learning, especially if, you're just out of school and becoming a founder. You're going to make mistakes. So I got really good at putting my foot in my mouth, good at apologizing, and then everything else I would continue to work on and grow at. But in the meantime, it was important to be able to repair things that went wrong. And then, another thing I'll always keep with me is that the team you put together, I came to really appreciate how lucky I was to have this small part of everybody's career journey that they were choosing to spend with me. So, if you're lucky, you get 5 years of somebody's journey before they usually move on. Not always, but most commonly. So if I learned it was really important to figure out how can I align what we need to what they need, and move both of those things forward together.
That is such a beautiful framing of it, and just how cool. I love your story so much, and the more that I hear about it in different ways and formats and um just all of this, I get to experience so much awe and excitement. And what I'm so curious about, you mentioned being the reluctant CEO, and there was this piece before about connecting the dots. And so before one even finds themselves um, rooting for each of their employees' journeys, or really building trust and building the story, there's this storytelling piece that perhaps you had to work on in connecting those dots that you were seeing, being really curious, asking questions to be at that moment where you reluctantly stepped into this role. But what I'm wondering is, from my experiences, there are spaces that really support interdisciplinary thinking and curiosity and the ability to make these connections. And then there are spaces where there is such a focus on one thing, and there is friction in making those connections. And I was wondering if you could speak to either encountering that friction or and navigating through it to hold that vision of those connections. Because to me, that's where a lot of the most interesting problems lie, where we're connecting the deep tech piece, the regulatory piece, because of how innovative the product is, and the piece about the business and making it viable. And there's each of these pieces, and oftentimes folks in each of these groups can look at it in isolation, but to really be someone who can see the big picture, what have you learned about making those connections, holding that truth, and then telling that story? Because I think at present, that is where I find the biggest challenge in being able to hold that vision, even as I experience the friction.
Yeah, I think that shows up in so many different places. It shows up in fundraising and how you tell the story. It shows up in how you manage different groups within the company, like the engineering team versus the R&D team. It shows up in how you develop your product roadmap and communicate it with customers. I think for me, I really love jigsaw puzzles, and I find that being an entrepreneur feels like solving a puzzle all day long. And to solve that kind of puzzle, you need to both know the big vision and the long-term goal you're working towards, but then you also need to be able to dive into the details and figure out all of the like individual pieces and have a strategy there and run that pretty tightly. Um, so looking at, maybe on the engineering and R&D side, I spent the first couple years of Accion smushing those together accidentally. And, that was partly out of necessity because we did not have a proof of concept right out of the lab when we spun out that was ready to sell to any segment of the market. Not even the smallest kernel of value could we deliver without first doing some more R&D. I think ideally we would have incubated the technology longer until there was only some engineering and product development left before we could get to the first segment. Um, but alas, it was not to be so. But in an ideal world, you don't have any R&D on your product roadmap. Your engineers' sprints are not planned around incorporating new inventions that don't have a timeline. So you can separate the two things, like one with a deterministic timeline that experienced engineers can forecast pretty well. And on the other hand, the innovation that you just can't schedule and that needs to be run more loosely. Those people should have space to, read new papers, go visit labs, go to conferences, um, take walks in nature and stuff, because you're asking them to do new things that haven't been done before. So separating those as best you can is important, but sometimes, like I said, that just you can't because of the reality of things. And then if you can't and you have unknown timelines and you're trying to do this as a venture-backed business, you need to have investors that will give you some privacy and time to go away and finish the inventing and R&D before you can switch over to an engineering timeline. Um, I think the other places with customers, if you're talking to people, I think at the right level to sign really big contracts, you're really selling them on the big vision. So you need to be able to inspire people around that. And then once you're aligned there, you get into the details and you make your program budget and schedule and you start executing to the details, but you really are selling from a place of the vision that hopefully you both share. Um, so those are some of the places where those kind of tensions show up, and in my experience, how I've learned to manage them.
That's so helpful to hear because I think what I'm hoping listeners can take away is that even when you're in the friction, you can take these lessons and know that you're learning it as a reason, and you can apply it in so many different contexts, and that I'm always meaning making when there's just something really tough that I'm navigating. And it's so helpful to hear that it's a little bit like strength training. Like I'm experiencing this
Mhm.
challenge and it's making me stronger truly because I can then do so much with it across so many different domains. And what I would love to learn more about next is how you've applied your CEO life and becoming the CEO of both this company and your own life as your North Star, and how you've really attuned this to your personal values process. I think you shared that you've created such a beautiful ritual of not just having personal values, but also expanding it and extending it to your family. I would love to just hear more about that for you.
Yeah, I think big shout out to Brene Brown for her, values type exercises. In addition to always learning on the technical side, I'm also doing personal growth type things, trying to build a meditation habit, which I think you have and is inspiring when I see you talk about that. Um, so I had done some of this soul searching. Usually it's not when I've been in the thick of starting a company. It's been at like the seams in my career, deciding to go to grad school or not, deciding to start a company or not. It's when I go back to those like designing your life type books and try to understand who I am and what I want. So I've learned about myself that I'm a technologist that tries to be a kind, warm person. I want to make the world a better place and, you know, be good. And so I've done all those sorts of exercises for myself. And like I mentioned, I think I love puzzles, and this again fits into that. Like, what's the big picture, and then how do I make all the pieces fit? And then after having kids, I my husband and I were really on the same page with like the way we hire and manage employees. Not that there's a really strong analogy there, but bear with me. Is to give them like a really solid mission statement so they understand how what they're doing contributes to what the company's trying to achieve. And then within that, just letting them operate with a lot of autonomy and freedom and all of that. And so for our kids, we wanted to do somewhat the same. And there's also a French parenting book called Bringing Up Bebe that talks about this concept, called The Box, cadre, cadre. I can't do the French R. And it's like be firm, really firm about the important boundaries, and everything else, let them go. Let them be kids, let them, make messes, and figure out what you really care about and teach them from there. And so we created our system of family values, and the first one's curiosity. So we're just lifelong learners, and we want to instill that in the kids too. The next one is courageousness, and that's because both my husband and I had experiences growing up that were really formative, where we felt like we made important decisions based on getting other people to like us. And we want and I think, even today, that can still, influence our decisions too. So we want to be really clear about what we know is right and what we know we're actually passionate about and want to do, and to stand up for that and make decisions from that place. So we wanted to share that with the kids. And then the third one is being loving or kind. And we use that, to mean outwardly with other people, but also inwardly, take care of your body, get healthy sleep. So those are the three family values. And, to be honest, the nice thing about values too is that you can take most situations and fit them into one of those some way or another to get what you want. Um, But as the kids get older, they start to be able to make their own decisions from that framework, and eventually to think critically about the framework itself and maybe throw it out and make their own. But we have this window of time where we can help them think about these things.
I love that so, so much. And I am a huge Brene Brown fan myself. And it's so exciting to hear you talk about her and meditation and taking care of your body and all of these things that really are so foundational to have the clarity and the conviction to set up those values, both for yourself, as a conversation, with your partner, and then more broadly for your family. And what I would love to learn more about is setting up that those preliminary conversations about defining values as they show up for your partner, for anyone in the co-creation stage of their relationship. So I, for example, have my values written out, and that has taken me a couple of years to just get comfortable with articulating what that looks like and what that means, because as I've looked at all of the words and all of the ways you can describe values, there's so many. And typically the exercises and Dr. Brown's research um, funnels it down to two to three. And sometimes that exercise can be really challenging for folks. And what I've wondered is, of course, with my partner, and as I suspect in most and all relationships, you have this alignment of values, and it's um, I think a really fun exercise to do together. Um, but also in co-creation, there might be differences, or just the sharing process of, instead of three, maybe we have six. So I don't know if it's quite that mathematical. I think my mind just goes to numbers and like the metrics. And values also just they're also just felt, and they're words for how we embody these aspects. And I was wondering what those conversations and what that setup looked like, and if it was okay, we're going to pick six, or we have to pick two, or there's no rules. We're just going to look at this and kind of have a conversation about it. I'm just so curious about how that went in those early conversations.
Yes. Well, I would say a few things about that. The first one I mentioned, curiosity, that is really what brought us together. I think that was, if we don't have this, then we're not going to work. It doesn't even matter what we try to, share with a future family. So that was kind of a no-brainer for us. But I think generally, I would say the way that we backed into these three was that we thought about the sort of turning point moments in our lives, both, the positive ones, but also maybe some negative ones, or places where we still carried, some regret or disappointment or something, and thought about like what can we extract from that when we're thinking about the values. And so that's how we landed on these particular ones. um, Actually, the last one, kind or loving, was important. I think I had just come back from some, what's it called, like loving kindness meditation thing. So was feeling it very outwardly, but also we were struggling with how to talk to our kids about food and bedtime. And so we wanted also to have a way to talk about like healthy sleep and moving your body and understanding what you put in it are the pillars here, and we can cram that all into being loving to yourself. So it was like kind of also what we knew would be sort of the tough parts to talk about and to teach our kids about. How could we attach those to values? Um, and then as far as the number, at Accion, we had five values. And I thought that was a fine number too. When you're trying to teach them to your 3-year-old, which we do, we like drill them on the way to school. Like, what's our second value? Um, you know, five might be a couple too many, and they're all like a little bit squishy, so you can kind of stuff what you need into each one. But I will say that, again, back to the storytelling, telling your kids, sharing like the personal anecdote of where it came from and why it's important, and having it be, genuine and a bit unique, really helps them understand and recall and figure out how to apply those values themselves. So I did that at Accion too. Each one, had the name of the value, the definition, but also the anecdote or like some unique way that we thought about applying it. And that was all my way of creating like our internal kind of jargon and how people would talk to them inside their own head about what was important to us.
Oh, I love that so much. Yeah, that is my dream. I am so excited to do this both for my future family and for a company. I've done it at my present organization with um, different Dare to Lead Brene Brown workshop styles, so leading workshops at work. But I had so much fun doing it, and I think, yeah, typically in organizations there's five, but just to kind of broadly be able to do that and then operationalize it, as you were saying, and finding those micro moments in our day to day, I think that's where really that magic lives. And what I've loved is you've shared how you've translated these frameworks, and we can think about them as CEO frameworks or just North Star frameworks, things that really anchor us, and applying them holistically across work and life. What are some of those frameworks that you've translated across from your CEO life into your personal life more broadly when it comes to tools? You've mentioned prioritizing, you've mentioned using the latest in technology to make your personal life more seamless and just integrate across all these different areas. I would love to hear more.
Great. Yeah, I think, I've gone totally off the deep end into vibe coding. And it started about 2 years ago when I was building out the product for our latest company, and moved on to the software side out of hardware for a bit. Um, and then with everything that has happened more recently in particular with coding agents, I've gone crazy. But I did, keep in mind my vision and values and all that stuff. And um, have really tried to apply what I'm playing with and building with today. Um, apply my vision and mission and keep all of those things front and center. So one of the risks I think that, a lot of people talk about with something like OpenClaw, where you can have a tool now that helps you triage your inbox and take a bunch of admin off your plate, is that then you can answer even more emails and you can do even more admin because now you've freed up all this time. And so to avoid falling into that trap, I again, like to pull myself back up to sort of the big picture of the jigsaw puzzle and think like, what's my goal here? And so one of the very first things I did when I set up my OpenClaw, who I named Stanley, I love to ask what people have named their OpenClaws, is this framework that I used as a CEO. I used this monthly to set my priorities each month. And the framework for the CEO life was from a book called Startup CEO by Matt Blumberg. And I've just shared this so widely because I found it so impactful. It was just a list of questions that addressed, five or six different areas of the CEO job. And I used the list every month with my chief of staff. We would run through the questions and we would figure out where we like felt this like body response to like, oh, that's important and is not going so well. I think we need to focus there. And that's how then I would figure out what I should spend my time on over the next month, because really there are 1 million things you're supposed to be doing, but how do you figure out like the two that you can actually get done well that month? So this was how I did that. And with Stanley and I took that list and adapted it for my personal life. And so on the last Friday of each month, Stanley and I run through the personal framework questions and we figure out what feels most important. So, my priorities for the next month. And then when Stanley helps me with my emails or scheduling appointments or anything like that, at first he passes it through the priorities and tells me, like, yeah, this person has emailed 4 times about setting up this meeting, but this doesn't seem to align with anything you said was important this month. I'll schedule it for 9 weeks from now. And I'm like, perfect. So instead of just freeing up more room for more stuff, we're actually prioritizing against what my body and my heart and whatnot have told me is important for that month.
I love that so much, specifically combining the newest tool and a really valuable personal use case with the somatic resonance of what is actually hard and moving forward and really pushing through those blocks. And I'm so curious for anyone who really finds tools like OpenClaw intimidating or prompting it to, or even setting it up to be really challenging. What is a way that you have embraced it and ironed out any friction in setup? I've recently found myself in circles of just really incredible women in San Francisco, and they happen to be non-technical circles as I learn more about the business side and all these other um, really important functions. And I'm grateful to be there as someone who's currently in a technical role. And I find that um, I find myself being really curious about what makes it hard as I kind of tinker and figure it out. And sometimes that's the gap. Um, it's just the push to tinker and figure it out. But then there's also just the practical piece of, okay, this is how I researched the tool and then this is how I implemented it. Um, I'm sure there'll be some wonderful pieces you'll write about on Substack about this too, that I think will help us get into the nitty-gritty. But for someone who just does feel intimidated, um, across the gender spectrum, what um, would you suggest starting with as step one?
Well, I'll just say one of my another big learning throughout my life is that nobody really has any idea what they're doing. Um, it can, there are a lot of situations I find myself in where I'll feel intimidated, and then after spending a little time there, I'll realize that they didn't know what they were doing either, which is comforting, but also a little scary sometimes. But um, so I would, always remind myself of that. And then I have been, blessed to have 4 really great sleepers. My kids have always slept very well. So my husband and I have from 5:30 to 7 each morning where he usually exercises. I exercise later in the day. So I spend that time with an Americano and usually taking an online course or watching YouTube videos on something. So I I had just a little bit of software experience through college and grad school, some Python, mostly MATLAB, which is not so useful for Stanley. So I took over building our whole product for Squawk AI, which was a large language model based, with Python back end and an iOS app front end. So I had to learn all those pieces and I, pushed that app to production and we had close to 400 pilots using it. And we were probably close to onboarding the last 200 pilots that were going to use it. And I was still like, what is GitHub again? And so again, nobody knows, everybody is sort of faking it till they make it in a lot of ways out there. So for me, what really felt like a big unlock was taking this, I think it was a 90-hour course on Udemy for iOS development. And It was project based, which I would totally recommend. So not just, trying to absorb information from YouTube, but actually creating things along with the course. And what was nice was that it just started from such a basic place. I was pretty sure I had installed an IDE before on my computer, but wasn't sure where I put Python and how to find it and what version are you supposed to use? If you have a Mac, you totally know what I'm talking about. And, what's a virtual environment, all this stuff. So the course started with those basics. And now, I've filled in a lot of gaps that I had by doing this class. What I actually found was like pleasantly, surprisingly useful was that by doing a project based course, I saw a lot of tips and tricks. I think the instructor's name is Angela Yu, and she would share like what website she goes to get color palette design ideas, where she gets icons, where you can view screenshots of other people's designs to get ideas. And so I would have never known all these places to go. So that was a surprising benefit of sticking it out through a whole project-based course. We built like 15 apps, I think. So I would totally recommend just making a daily, very regular habit of learning and signing up for some of these courses. They're really great. Ed Donner is another good one on the like applied AI engineering side.
I love that so much. And I loved how, well, one, thank you for just speaking to the humanness of figuring it all out. I think um, I've definitely looked to iconic people like yourself thinking like, oh my gosh, they just have everything figured out. They just know everything. And of course, like we're all figuring it out. And just to hear you say that in particular is like very, very meaningful to me. And I resonate so deeply with knowing, okay, I have the Python skills and the MATLAB skills from my aerospace engineering background, but there's all these new areas I want to learn about. What is the scaffolding that I can create around that? And I love the 5:30 to 7 a.m. Um, ritual that you have for learning and how to, again, really practice this even alongside having a beautiful family and to really put all these pieces into play and keep learning because I think I'm personally experiencing just a combination of wanting to learn so many things and then figuring out what to pick first. And I think there's no right or wrong answers, but this course that you mentioned in particular, given that it's project based, I think just carving out those specific blocks are where
Mhm.
the magic lies for me too, across the plethora of projects I'm interested in. So I'm so grateful for your wisdom there. And you've also shared just your joy of using Notebook LLM to go deeper into areas during school pickup and drop off, and in some of the communities in San Francisco. Amongst moms, I've also heard that being reflected back where they're really excited about learning during school pickup, drop off, and again, like sharing that scheduling with their partners. I'm so curious, what has that looked like in practice? How have you sort of set that up? Do you have sort of like a learning schedule or just as curiosities arise? Um, and how do you prioritize what to learn first? Because there's so much to learn when you're curious.
Right, absolutely. I think on the like software learning side, the recommendation to solve one of your own problems is very sound because then you'll end up sticking it through the bugs and you'll maintain it and see it all the way through. I think, oh, actually, that is a tip of mine is to finish, like actually finish the projects you start. One, because you learn so much in like closing that last gap between the working proof of concept and getting it into the app store or deploying it and letting other people use it and things like that. And two, because um, I just hate the feeling of starting and not finishing a lot of things. So I don't know. Maybe that's not a strong reason to do it, but the sense of accomplishment, and I think it builds momentum, and you'll be more eager to start your next project if you don't have all these like half baked, half finished things lying around weighing on your brain. Um, and then on the Notebook LM side, I have loved this. I've told everybody to do it, inspired a lot of users out there. I've been having to learn about new areas either because I want to write a new post, like when I wrote a nuclear piece recently and needed to learn about some aspects of that. Or I always am exploring new deep tech ideas, whether it's to consult with a new team or considering going after a problem myself. So it's usually like maybe one or two topics at a time I'm trying to go deep in. And Notebook LM has been such a great tool. So you can give it a prompt. I usually go into my terminal and ask Claude Code to write the prompt to then give to Notebook LM, but it doesn't really know. It gives you way too many characters and structures it stupidly. So you have to edit it a lot. But anyway, it's turtles all the way down. So I have Claude write the prompt to give to Notebook LM to go out and find the right sources. And usually I end up with around 70 sources on the topic. And that's usually through like a series of maybe two or three different prompts to make sure I've got enough coverage of the types of angles I want to explore this problem from. So around 70 sources from two or three prompts. And then I move into the chat box. It's Gemini powered, and ask it the question that, I'm usually like teasing out a thesis or trying to understand the potential of solving a problem from a new angle, or usually it's like, what are the boundaries of our knowledge on this subject I'm trying to understand. So I have like a little chit chat back and forth to really like kind of refine the thesis I'm toying with. And then I prompt it to then create an audio note with a specific question. And then it gives you like a 45-minute podcast to listen to. And some I was going to say I learned really well from audio in the audio format, but that's actually not true. Having now had to stop listening to this audiobook because I would just totally zone out every time the speaker started speaking. But I think the Notebook LM voices are like tuned to have like attention grabbing tones and inflections and things. Um, and so then I get to listen to that while I'm, on a run or school stuff. But I will say I'm trying to be really mindful of like not just creating a little notebook LM echo chamber. So I'm always like trying to like prompt it to give me the counter argument or tell me why the thesis I'm working on could be wrong, and gather sources around that and make the counter argument to my point, just to make sure I'm not like just reinforcing my own wrong beliefs.
That is so helpful to hear because I am definitely such a audio learner as well, and I love listening to podcasts and being on walks or even doing my chores and errands or walking to the gym. And now I'm thinking about all of those moments where I could be learning. And I'm so excited because, again, I've just had this growing list of things that I want to learn more about. And it can feel, again, intimidating, and then carving out that time for when to do it and prioritizing which piece. I think those were the pillars that I was looking to kind of fit this into. And I'm so grateful for how you've shared everything so beautifully and so helpfully, because now I know I can like go and execute on each of this. And I'm so curious, you've spoken to both the spaces we create within our homes and our setup and our schedules, but also where we live physically as being really intentional and thoughtful and really helping us set up these conditions for success and joy. And it's been so fun seeing you live and embody that. I'm so curious, what are those environments you've put yourself in that have actually created those serendipitous encounters?
Yeah, well, in thinking about like my physical space right now, my life priority is just not being buried alive by Legos. So I can't say that my house is really conducive to creativity or peace or anything. I do have a walking desk treadmill thing under a standing desk that I love so much. So I would say that's maybe my number one thing that makes me feel good in my physical space every day, and my espresso machine. But maybe a related point is that I still feel like we're fairly new to Palo Alto, even though we've been here almost 5 years this July. But it's always hard moving and making new friends, and making new friends as an adult is just awful in general. But moving and having to do it, so we've really leaned into hosting, and in particular for different like groups we're members of. So like the MIT Alumni Club of Northern California, we offer to host things for that group, and got to know the current president of that. My husband's a pilot, so we do a lot of hosting for pilots in the area. So finding groups and opening up our home and offering to host. If we hear of a friend, we have a lot of friends that write books, and they often pass through here on their book tour. So we'll offer to host them a book launch party. Um, just so, getting over the friction and hump of hosting and doing it a lot has really helped us build really neat relationships out here.
That is so amazing. And it's so creative and generous and open-hearted and kind. And again, I love seeing you live and embody all of this. And I agree, it's challenging to make those meaningful friendships at any stage, especially as you move. And you shared that you've loved to combine activities and stack them to really connect and also progress on just different goals like going to workout classes or maybe even learning. And I'm so curious as to how you've set that up and how you've really continued to nurture these relationships. Um, and also, what are some activities that you're really excited about doing in terms of stacking?
Yeah, that has really been like the only way I have close friendships at this point in my life, is meeting friends for exercise classes and grabbing a tea before or after, or just walking around the block. I think we're all so busy right now. Everybody has young kids at this moment in our lives. And so we all want to exercise and we all want to be social. And so combining those two has made it much easier to see people. I see, my close girlfriend sometimes 3 times a week. Like if I don't see them in one week, it's a bad odd week. So that's been really, really nice, uh, to combine those. And I think it also is sort of a little hack, like, in thinking fast and slow, where the Kahneman wrote that if you put a pencil in your mouth, it like makes your cheeks kind of in the shape of a smile, and your brain actually thinks you are smiling, and it goes backwards. So workout classes and getting a tea after almost feels like running errands with a friend or doing nothing with a friend, which to me is a signal of like that's a real deep friendship. You've put in the hours there. So you're almost kind of hacking it. You're like, we must be so close because all we did was walk around the block 3 times. And it also, another reason it's great is if you're meeting for dinner, it can feel there's more pressure, even just like if you're sitting across from each other, and having to have a conversation feels different from walking side by side with a friend, through the farmer's market or something like that.
That is so, so beautiful. And I love that tip about the hack. I now am reflecting on just the friendships where I have done that and I didn't realize that that's what I was doing. And so I'll definitely think about that more as I stack as well. And it's just been such a joy to have you on, and you've been such an expander to me and just held this vision for a future self version of me for so long before I ever reached out to you and wrote to you. So it's just been so incredible speaking to you today. I was hoping to jump into the rapid fire questions if you're ready.
Sure. Yes, I've got a few more minutes. Um,
Yes.
yeah, great.
What does wellness mean to you today?
Getting enough sleep and moving my body and eating good food.
What does leadership mean to you today?
Hmm. Um, oh, I was thinking of like a leader I would follow, but I guess it's more general. Being able to inspire to a big vision while being a good person.
Thank you so, so much for joining me. I am so grateful.
Yeah, thank you, Ricky. Thanks for the really thoughtful questions and research you did and the great conversation this morning.